Our first speaker today at Vintage Computer Festival Pacific Northwest is Dr. Cynde Moya, Collections Manager at the museum. That wasn't what I was supposed to say. My cache memory is too limited in order to do it properly, and I'm going to get out of the way now. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, once again, I'm Cynde Moya, Collections Manager here at Living Computers Museum and Labs. Before I was Collections Manager, I was librarian and archivist. So I'm a librarian and archivist as well. I've been here for over 6 years taking care of this collection. I took several of these presenters down for a tour this morning, and they were pretty impressed with our computers, vintage computers in the basement and stuff. All of the stuff that you see up there on the second floor is, it's maybe 2%, 5% of what our real collection is. There's a lot of stuff in the background supporting it. So I'm going to talk today about our vintage time-sharing computer systems, and I'm going to start by reading you a paper for about, 7 or 8 minutes that I wrote. I started to think about, well, what are we doing here at Living Computers Museum and Labs, and what is academia saying about museums, about software, about how to study software in museums, in the academy, and there is this new field called, variously, software studies, new media studies, critical code studies, platform studies, infrastructure studies, media archaeology, or plain old cultural studies. You'll see this happening. It's happening at like media studies, communications departments in universities. Sometimes they call it digital humanities. So there's a really interesting thing going on out there. People who are now studying software, games, and trying to say stuff about it. So here's the paper. Most published academic works dismiss the notion of keeping vintage computing equipment running in such a way as to let visitors use the real thing. LCM&L didn't get this memo. Running real software on real equipment is part of our mission. I've got some quotes up here, but I'm going to say most of it. Dennard and Lohr, in their paper about building a software museum, think that actually installing a program on a computer where it can be run and used interactively by visitors is an approach that will never work. In his commentary to their work, Bauer concludes that museum visitors should not immediately be confronted with sophisticated equipment. Instead, they should have the opportunity to play with objects such as pieces of wood. Behrman dismisses the idea of keeping old equipment running, writing, "Fortunately, no serious investment in the solution of preserving obsolete hardware and software has been attempted." Rothenberg notes that although keeping older equipment alive exudes a certain technological bravado, I love that, it is ultimately hopelessly labor-intensive and ultimately infeasible. So that's just my evidence. I took it out of books, real scholars saying stuff. Faced with this discouraging analysis, here I am, helping the engineers at Living Computers keep those vintage computers running, this legacy software, so that visitors can play with this sophisticated equipment. Behrman is now proved wrong, as LCM&L is making a serious attempt in this solution, although admittedly, these efforts do exude technological bravado. It's fortunate that the engineers and archivists at LCM did not read these analyses, but rather set about figuring out how to keep vintage computers alive for our visitors to use. The philosophical or postmodern questions that arise in academic conversations. How much of a vintage computer can you replace with new hardware or emulations before it is no longer the same vintage computer? How authentic is the experience? What does it mean, anyway, are less of a concern for LCM&L. We favor pragmatic goals. How to keep this thing running? How to get the time-sharing operating systems to work? What other software can we provide on these computers? How to provide manuals and quick start guides to help visitors enter into the experience of using old computing machinery. I'm reading the old paper, so I don't have my conclusion. But I do have, these are the number, we have on our website. You ordinary mortals can go and sign up for an account on several of our working time-sharing computers that are sitting right upstairs. These are, as of a couple days ago, the number of people who have signed up for the accounts. This goes, the tops 10 and tops 20 from Digital Equipment Corporation is really popular. The CDC 6500 running NOS is very flaky, so you'll be lucky if you can get on there. But we've got a couple of engineers working on that all the time. And part of what they have to do is replace the core memory a lot. So there's a lot of contemporary equipment going in there, but you can see the difference. It's pretty fun to go and look at it to see that the plexiglass with the little tiny chip that's replacing this horrible core memory thing. Before I go further, I would like to ask you, the community of users, how you think that these computers could be useful in a teaching or a hobbyist, or what way are they useful? I mean, they're fun. It's fun to go and log on to them. It's interesting to go and look at these operating systems. But in some ways, I really think that we are a solution looking for a problem. And we've got all these computers and these operating systems, and we really think, this is a great way to have a software museum with the old equipment running. Unlike what most of the scholarly work is saying, how unlikely that is as a project. So I was wondering if you could call out a little bit. What do you think this would be good? Architecture studies in a computer science department? Bulletin boards, right. How bulletin boards work?
Like the old stuff, like CompuServe or the Source or Delphi.
Forums, huh? So this is really the social uses of these computers.
Yeah.
I teach microprocessors at University of Washington right now.
Hi, Joe.
And hi. And we teach the history of the architecture. We teach, for example, microprocessors from back before they had memory management built into them, so that we could run hardware that does logic analysis. And so stuff like this is history. And we teach the students to understand what has happened, because that gives them a better chance of anticipating where things might go. And what processes happened before might repeat themselves later.
That's good. Knowing what happened before to help guide the future progress of computer technology.
Cynde, like our friend here said, so it seems that every one of these has solved a problem that came before. It would be useful to see the progression in hardware, not just how it informs future decisions, but how it informs current design decisions. So if you see why something changed and what problem it solved, if we've got the hardware out there, we're able to do these examples where you can actually see that the next machine solved the problem that the previous machine couldn't do.
I show the relationships between the systems. You teach a little bit of history that CDC came before Cray, et cetera. But the architectures, the evolution of the architectures would be fascinating.
Yeah, we've got some computers here that help tell that story, like Cray's CDC 160A influenced the PDP-5 and the 6, which influenced the link age, which goes on like that. So there's a number of families of architecture that, we have them here, but we're perhaps not representing it or interpreting it well enough.
The thing I really like about being able to access simple machines is about the way things are designed now, whether it's user interfaces or operating systems or anything else. It's not necessarily the best designs we want. Like we aren't necessarily in a place where like everything's absolutely perfect as it can be. And by looking back at older things, we can look at solutions that ended up being evolutionary dead ends, but actually can inform modern designers as they think about ways to do things.
That's nice. Yeah, dead ends that are not successful now could actually inform us if we look at them more closely.
One thing I've been told by younger folks who visited here, they don't even talk about Linux. So like it's irrelevant to them because that's what they grew up with.
Well, let me log into a couple of these things. So first, if you're on Windows, you have to download PuTTY, which if you're on a Mac, it's easier. You just use something called Terminal, I think. Okay, so now I'm on our Unix System 5 3v2. This is pretty sophisticated because it already it starts with having a menu, which is fun, and it's got the things that you might expect a bulletin board to have, like a bulletin board or Microsoft Word, games. The games are really fun to play, but I'm going to start with the BBS. And then I'm going to go to chat because we know that's what you want to do when you're on a bulletin board. So I'm like, who's there? Hi. So I got SMJ. I got Bree. So my friends are on. Isn't this great? Okay. He wants to play Maze War. So exit. How do I get out of here? Quit. And 5. What's that? So, you probably remember this part too. Going back to your reference material. Oh, all right, I'm in a Rickroll. Okay. Okay, here I am, playing Maze War. He's there, he's really a lot better than me. Makes me anxious when this guy. Hey. Fuck. So. So, this was the best thing since sliced bread a while back, is the Maze War thing. So we've got the Josh Dirsch, one of our engineers, wrote an Alto emulator. that is right upstairs. You can sit down and play on the real alto Maze War with people you're sitting right next to. So, okay, how do I get out of this? So, here's some other ones. I really like the Sigma. The Sigma 9 is also up there in the raised floor room.
Just double click on that.
Doesn't like that. All right, Sigma. And this Sigma is really amazing because it's just as solid as a rock. Oh. There. So, basic. Sitting there, there's some really great stuff on here, including Maze War. We could go, what is this Snoopy? Oh, there you go. That's Snoopy. This is what we do with our $1 million computers. We've got a number of Snoopies. Also, the CDC 6500's got Snoopy on his doghouse, flying back and forth across the DD60, which is pretty amazing. We can also play Oregon Trail. It takes a little longer to load Oregon. A longer. This Oregon Trail is unusual because you die of pneumonia instead of dysentery. So let's see, I'm an ace. I want 200 on the oxen. I want 400 on the food. Here's some ammos, clothes, miscellaneous. Oh, I overspent. 200, that's 400. 600. Okay, now I have no money. Let's continue. Eat. Let's attack. Oh. Let's continue. So this, do you remember Oregon Trail? It's pretty fun. It's similar to the one that's come out on later on the Apple II. I'm not really sure of the etiology of it, how it came to be here, and if Mac made it off of this one, or what. So we've got a bunch of different computers, as I pointed out. You can try out the Zork on the Toad 2, which is a emulator of a PDP-10, or which is like Adventure, Zork Adventure, Dungeon. So there's some really famous games. Some of the first text-based adventure games we've got here. You can also find things like Fortran and COBOL compilers, and so you can write little programs in these different things. So I think being able to use these programs on the real computer is really interesting. You can also, I think there's a guy in here right now who has got an emulator, and he is testing it against the real computer that we've got running here to see if the emulator is working. So at any rate, we're doing some really cool things here. I can't say enough wonderful things about our great engineers. We've got a big engineering team of about eight engineers and contractors who come in here every day working on these computers dedicatedly every day, which is just a lot of toil. It's a great guest services team. who are giving tours. Of course, my team, the collections, we're taking care of all this deluge of stuff that's coming in. If you came on the tour this morning and saw all that stuff, that's our responsibility, is those massive refrigerators and disk drives the size of washing machines and discs the size of 10-layer cakes, and just this crazy, big, weird equipment. And we've got some other great teams, education, marketing. It's a great project here. We're planning on being here for a very, very long time, and look forward to working with the hobbyists and the other people in the community to spread the excitement of vintage computing. I want to thank you so much for listening. See you around.
You should take questions, I believe so, yes. Questions?
What's your relationship with the vendors like DEC, well, Oracle, I guess now, that with the OSs for all these vintage machines, considering that sometimes the software rights don't translate or transfer?
I'm working with a group called the Software Preservation Network, which is a strongly national and somewhat international, and in universities and museums. And one of their special interest groups is this legal group that is working on copyright and fair use of software in museums. So instead of fighting the copyright, we're looking at ways to generalize fair use such that museums don't have to be so paranoid about making copies of things. That's one way. There has not been a legal challenge yet about museums using vintage software. There's certainly a big problem because these companies have been bought and bought and bought. Nobody even knows where the source code is or who owns it, and they don't really care. But you never know. Maybe somebody, is going to rise up, particularly us with our deep pockets owner, and say, let's sue them, make the test case there. So DEC has given out hobbyist licenses. Some of the other companies have made individual deals with certain museums. We're working on it. We're part of a larger organization, right? So we're not doing it on our own.
This thing working? Check. It has checked. Civil. Are you, I'm just curious with your librarian background too, is a common exchange being developed similar to the Dewey Decimal System for referencing software titles so that people have some standard platform when they're talking about those?
There's a number of efforts moving on that. Games, I think games is further ahead with like the video game metadata schema that Jinha Lee's group is working on at the University of Washington. There's a couple of really large, unwieldy standards. There's one called Premise that has got a lot of fields that have to do with migration. So every time you migrate, and you take another hash, and then you migrate, take another hash. So all of the transforms that you do with the thing is also tracked in the metadata, which it's just really complicated. And this is something that the metadata working group is working on of the Software Preservation Network. There really isn't one yet, but they did a questionnaire across cultural heritage institutions and found that everybody is doing something sort of locally grown that depends on what they are doing. So they're collecting data that helps them to do their local things, whatever they're doing. We kind of do the same thing, trying to align the field so that eventually we'll be able to crosswalk them and they'll be meaningful in other ways. But the final, mark record kind of standard has not solidified. No one has won this battle yet.
migrate to a common, I mean, that could really be a mess.
Yeah, I think, I'm very hopeful that it will migrate, but there's a lot of things that people are doing that are not necessarily important in other institutions. So it can get really unwieldy. You know, books are so much easier. You know, books are so well understood, right? It's just a book, right? And it has certain book-like quality. Yeah, I mean, the software you need to know the operating system and what's going to render it and what kind of computer it's going to run on. So then all that stuff has to be held in the metadata as well. Is there an emulator?
Or ask you a question, right? Not heckling? Okay.
Hi, Cynde. I was wondering, what was your favorite computer in our collection?
Master.
That's like asking which is your favorite child, you know? Which one do you love the best?
But you have a favorite.
I like the 6500 and the other Cray computers. Right, the Cray 2 is really, I'm very fond of that. I'm really fond of the 160A. So those things, they're really, you know, beautiful, exquisitely designed. So, you know, in an industrial design sort of way. The Bendix G15 is also really cute. But, you know, I like them all. I like the Altair, I like S100s.
How does the LCM in general feel about emulation? Because like one of the organizations I'm very interested in is the Internet Archive. They've been putting a lot of work into developing emulators that'll let you run a lot of vintage software on, you know, in a browser, for example, because, you know, modern computers have so much CPU power they can just brute force emulate.
As far as software preservation goes, you know, I love the way that the museum is, you know, we're keeping these old equipment running and then you can run the operating system on the real thing and deal with the problem. But really what's happening is emulation, particularly emulation as a service. And that's another thing that's being worked on. You know, eventually you will be able to, you'll find a program on your machine. It's like, I've got Maze War for the BBS, and you'll click on it, and it will spawn an emulator of the Unix in your browser, and then it will render your BBS there, and then you play Maze War. Or the same if you've got a website, some sort of technical website with a lot of illustrations and links that worked on Netscape Navigator 1 on your Windows 3.1 machine. You click on that thing, it'll spawn the Windows 3.1, then it'll spawn the Netscape Navigator, and then it will render that thing for you. That's emulation as a service. That's another thing that this metadata has to manage. So that's what's happening in the world. How do we feel? Well, you know, Josh, he made the Alto emulator, and it's all out there in the wild. You could download it and play Alto emulator all you like, and it works pretty much the same way, so exploring Smalltalk or playing pinball on it. He's working on another emulator now, not to be named. So we like them too. I mean, there's really a range of things. We emulate a lot of disk drives, particularly, and tape drives, because these mechanical things are really hard to keep running. And, you know, finding the right person who is just obsessed with vacuum pump tape drives is it's kind of hard to find. It's a little easier to emulate it, and then we've got the CPU working, emulating the the controller and the drive, and how real is it? That's a philosophical question. So.
I don't just tell jokes. Eric, IBM 1620 emulator at VCF West last year.
Yep.
1620?
Yeah.
Okay, great example of keeping the original artifact. It was a front panel, flip switches. The incandescent light bulbs had long since burned out. I think they have one remaining sample of an incandescent light bulb for that front panel. But they lovingly recreated it using LEDs, including the flicker that you would get from the real incandescents. So they simulated the flicker. And the nice thing about that approach was the hard part was being emulated on modern equipment, much easier to maintain, definitely infinitely better to source parts for. But you still got the experience of, I am flipping a switch, I am looking at particular LEDs, I am trying to debug what I just did. So that was a very nice approach too. Combination of easier to replace hardware switches and LED lights with emulation to give you the realism of it without having a full-size desk side machine.
Now that I think of it, Charles Anthony is going to be speaking a little later this afternoon about his Multics emulator, another really significant early operating system. And the panel is sitting right over there. So then you can actually log into that thing and make the lights blink. If you look at the wires on the back, those wires are carefully wired into their FPGAs so that all the blinky lights are meaningful according to what you're doing on the emulator. It's it took one of our best engineers weeks and weeks and weeks to get all those white wires lined up into the right spot. So take a look at the back too. It's a really impressive piece of work, and it just makes the emulator kind of that much more exciting.
Cynde lives here at the museum. You can find her in the basement usually. She'll be available later for your questions. Sorry. Thanks again.